Welcome back to Good Distinctions. I'm your host, Will Wright, and joining me today is Mike Aquilina. Mike, welcome to Good Distinctions.
Hey, thanks for having me, Will.
It's wonderful to have you. Mike, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but you are the co-founder of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. Being a graduate of Franciscan University, I have a fondness for the center, so
Nice.
it's wonderful to have you on today.
Well,
But if you could just introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit about who you are.
Well, my name is Mike Aquilina. I'm a writer with a special interest in the fathers of the church, the early history of Christianity, and I'm married. I have 6 grown children, and I have 8 grandchildren. After that, I don't know that there's a whole lot more to be known about me. I live in Pittsburgh, and I've been at this for some time now.
Well, and you've had multiple shows on EWTN as well,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
As a songwriter, I think a lot of your songs were recorded by some fairly well-known folks.
Yeah, I write music with Dion DiMucci, who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and our songs have been recorded by Dion himself, by Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen, Van Morrison, Jeff Beck, Amy Grant, Peter Frampton. The list goes on.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Well, and so the reason I asked you on today is to talk about your new book with Ignatius Press, Rabbles, Riots, and Ruins, 12 Ancient Cities and How They Were Evangelized. And I absolutely love this book. I was telling you before we recorded, I'm a history and religion teacher at the high school level, so
Yeah.
this was right up my alley. And, I have to say, as I was going through it, a lot of familiar ground for me, but I learned a lot of things as well, and I felt like I was in these cities. So you did
Oh,
a
then
great job capturing it.
thank you. I achieved my goal. What I try to do with all my books is to provide an imaginative entry into the ancient world. That's what I want for people, and I think that's what people want. That's why I'm still writing books, because people want to find that imaginative entry into that world. I think that accounts for the success of The Chosen as a television series, because again, it gives people an imaginative entry into that world. So I try to make them vivid, and I try to help people to understand what was going on then, and what were people concerned about, and how did they live.
Well, and you definitely hit that mark. It was a fantastic read, very accessible too. I mean, anyone could pick this up and really benefit from it.
Well, thank you.
So you go through a few cities. I have the book in front of me here. We've got Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, Ephesus, Edessa. I don't know how to pronounce a couple of these, to be perfectly honest. Lugdunum, I have no idea if that's right. And then Etchmiadzin, Constantinople, Milan, Ravenna, and Carthage.
Yeah.
So you go through all these ancient cities and contextualize sort of how the gospel was spread in these areas, and unfortunately how a lot of them came out of Christianity for at least a time. So it's a very interesting snapshot. But having done as many books and shows and all these things as you have, how did this particular book come about?
That's a good question. I can remember, boy, it must have been about 15 or 20 years ago. I had this idea that I would write a book about the 4 major cities, the 4 ancient patriarchal sees in Christianity, and I thought, oh, that would be a cool book, and I'd show people what these cities were like and what their people were like, and so on, because I travel a lot for work. And I go to a lot of different cities, and what I notice is that every city has a different character to it, right? You're not going to confuse Des Moines with Manhattan, or Dubuque with Los Angeles. Every city has a personality, a character, and that's true of the ancient world as well. That you get to know these cities, and they have a personality, and you want to bring it out, because most people just get to know them as points on a map or items on a list. And there's so much more than that. They were vivid. They had vivid differences from each other, and they also had a distinctive culture, a different topography. I wanted to bring all that into play in the story of these places. So anyway, I got the idea to do 4 cities, and this was 15 or 20 years ago, and I couldn't get a publisher interested in it. I just could not get any interest, and then many years later, I was talking to Mark Brumley at Ignatius, and I pitched this idea by him, and he took interest in it. So the book got written.
Excellent. Well, and I'm glad it did, because it's there's some really neat aspects in this. I mean, having studied history, having studied theology, you hear about these places and you think about them in a very static way, or at least a lot of my students do.
Mm-hmm.
They see snapshots. They don't see dynamic living places with people going about their human lives with their human wants and desires and strengths and weaknesses and quirks and idiosyncrasies. So it is really interesting. And then especially as an American, these cities are so old. I mean, we don't have old cities here in the United States at all. It's a very interesting thing.
I have a good friend who often observes that that when he's in one of these cities, he'll send me a note, and somewhere in the course of the note, he'll say, "They have indoor plumbing older than our civilization," which is true. Which is true.
So, out of these cities, maybe this is sort of an odd question, but I'm going to ask it anyway and see where it goes. But which of these cities is your favorite?
Oh boy, that I don't know if I can say. It probably depends on the day of the week. But I mentioned before that I intended to do a book on 4 cities, right? Well, I ended up with 12, and that's because I fell in love with each of them. I got to know about these cities, and I got to know what made them special, what made them different, and I just got caught up in it. So yeah, it probably does change from week to week. Currently, the city for me is Ravenna, because I'm planning to go there in the fall. I have never been to Ravenna, right? And I really want to see Ravenna. Why? Well, because it's built in a swampy area. It was the capital of the Western Roman Empire for a time, the very end of the Western Roman Empire. And it really was so far out of the way and so effectively surrounded by swamp that it was never overrun by all the barbarian hordes who came through Italy. So the churches still stand intact from the 5th century. And the artwork in those churches is still intact from the 5th century. So you go in and you see portraits of great figures like Galla Placidia, like St. Peter Chrysologus, and they're done in real time. These are portraits that were produced during their lifetime, so you can kind of be sure there's some verisimilitude there. There's something to them. So I'm so looking forward to seeing Ravenna this fall. That's at the top of my list these days because I'm thinking a lot about it. But if you ask me tomorrow, I might say Alexandria, and the day after tomorrow, I might say Antioch. On any given day, I might say Rome because I'm in love with the city of Rome, and I've been there so often. So I don't know. I don't know which is my favorite.
I was just talking about this with my wife this past week. We've each traveled to 7 countries. And for myself, I haven't left the Americas. I've never even left the continent. Whereas she's been to France and Switzerland. And so we're thinking about these things. And the reason I bring it up is then we started kind of dreaming, okay, where do we want to go? And it's very high on both of our list is Ireland, because we're both Irish. But then as Catholics, we also really want to go to Rome.
Yeah.
Never been. I mean, it sounds like an amazing place.
It is an amazing place, and it really is a good ramp up to travel, or especially to pilgrimage, because Rome is is built for pilgrimage. Rome, as we know it now, is built for pilgrims, and it's easy for you to get a good education because it's very well excavated there. The museums are wonderful, and there's just so much history there. There's so much pre-Christian history there. There's so much Christian history there. There's so many figures from the New Testament who walked those streets, and then the names of the church fathers. Well, almost all of them, got to Rome or wanted to get to Rome. So yeah, it's a rich history.
I can't think of any other examples other than the Roman Empire that were larger, had larger cultural significance even today. I mean, there's maybe the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's plenty that people don't think of that we just sort of take for granted, but certainly the Roman Empire was this large, massive thing, and it went up and down. There was the republics and the empire, and obviously the fall of Rome and the transfer of the capital to Byzantium and all of this. But it's interesting also how that Roman sort of culture and idea was assimilated into the Catholic Church, and very much in the sense of how the Roman Empire spread and sort of assimilated what was good and true, and not opposed to the Roman way. The church does the same thing. So when you're looking at these old cities and you're looking at the way that Christianity spread, how many parallels do you see with today? Or what lessons could we learn?
Well, there's a lot we can learn from Rome, as you point out, because Rome accomplished something remarkable, and I think that was providential. Augustus Caesar initiated some amazing projects, like a system of roads to get people quickly from one point on the planet to another point on the planet. And a lot of that was taking place in the first century and the second century, that those roads were spreading all over the Roman world. Right around that time, mariners discovered the trade winds, and so for the first time in history, they were able to travel on the open sea. I think all of this is providential because the apostles were able to take these routes and spread the gospel along those routes by land and by sea. It's a pretty remarkable thing that all of this kind of lined up historically. The other thing that we see in the Romans is kind of an openness to other peoples that you don't always find in the ancient world, right?
To put it mildly,
right? The world was divided into my people and your people, right? And my people kind of end at this boundary marker, and you find a lot of that kind of provincialism in the ancient world. But the Romans really were open to other peoples, other cultures, other religions. Really, there was a saying that the Orontes flowed into the Tiber, that all of these Eastern religions, from Syria, eventually found their way to Rome and got into the minds of Roman citizens, and then to their neighbors and so on. They became fads. A lot of Eastern religions. So the Romans had a certain kind of cosmopolitan sense, and they were open to many things, and they had a certain degree of welcoming that was unique. And we can learn from that. I mean, that's where I was going with that. We can learn from that kind of openness, that kind of welcoming, that kind of Catholicity with the small c, right? The word Catholic comes from the Greek word for universal, right? And the Romans certainly had that idea of universality. But all of these cities were largely evangelized by means of friendship. Not just by the roads. It's the roads that enabled friendship. The roads enabled contact. They enabled encounter among people, and that led to friendship. The Christians had no access to media at the time. There were no mass media, right? Like as we know them today, there were no newspapers or internet or television or radio or anything like that. So if you wanted to spread some news, or if you wanted to hear the daily news, you had to go and stand in the marketplace or stand in the public square, go stand somewhere where there were a lot of people, and there you could exchange ideas. There's so much that is alien to us in that idea, in that culture, that you'd have to leave your house in order to find out what was going on in the world. And your world that you would find out about was pretty small. The rumors you were hearing would only, cover a small space there. So yeah, it all comes down to friendship. You go out there, you hear the news, you make an encounter, you have a conversation, and you start to move ideas back and forth. People notice, your neighbors notice that you're a happy person. They say, I'm not a happy person. Why are you the way you are? I want to know what the secret is. And then you tell them the gospel. We have to keep in mind that during this period that I'm covering in the book, it was a capital crime to practice Christianity, and you could be executed for it on the morrow if you were caught. So again, you had no access to media. You couldn't even shout too loud in the marketplace, or it would be the end of your life. It wouldn't be a very effective apostolate because it would be over at the beginning. So anyway, it is a great story that's told, and it's really 12 different stories, because each story had a different character and had a different conversion story, so to speak.
Well, regardless of all the diversity, I mean, you show very clearly the Catholicity, like you say, that friendship, that closeness to people in communities, which is something that I think absolutely we need to recover today. People are so lonely. Everywhere I go, that's what I sort of encounter the most, is just isolation and loneliness.
Yes.
Which is ironic, because we are more connected, at least on the face, than we ever have been, and yet no one's really speaking with one another. They're getting their updates. They're seeing on social media these most curated versions of other people, but it's not really a sharing in life. So I think your point there is very well taken. I don't know how we get back to that. Maybe this is getting a little bit far from the book, but I'll ask the question anyway. I mean, how do you think that people can recapture some of that ancient wisdom, so to speak, of friendship in a communal societal sense?
I always recommend that people go and read a text from the late 2nd century. So we're talking about very early in Christian history, and it's called the Octavius. It's by a man named Marcus Minucius Felix, often listed just as Minucius Felix, right? It's a great little book. It's a memoir of a single weekend in his life, and it was a weekend he took a vacation at a resort near Rome with 2 of his lawyer friends. Marcus was a magistrate in Rome, and all 3 of them were from North Africa, so they were kind of expats living in Rome and working in Rome, and they shared a lot in common. 2 of them were Christians, and one of them was a traditional Roman, a pagan, we call him today. So they're on this resort, on this vacation at this resort, and they start to, have just a typical conversation with small talk, and pretty soon it escalates to religious ideas, and there's some tension there. And so they decide to have something of a debate. This is what lawyers do. They argue, right? And so they have a debate, and the 2 Christians convert the pagan. I'm sorry about the spoiler, but it's good to see how it's done, because they do it in a lawyerly way. So, as I said before, every story is different, and it's going to take into account your education, your background, your profession, what you do and who you hang around with. But what that story shows us is that it happened through conversation that was real, that acknowledged differences and confronted differences, and kind of worked through them. It's something to see, and it's a great snapshot, because the early Christians converted their world, and the church grew at a rate of 40% per decade, and that was pretty steady over the 250 years of persecution. The church continued to grow at a rate of 40% per decade, even though it was illegal to be a Christian and you could be killed for it, right? This is astonishing when you think
Yeah, it's
about it.
remarkable.
And I think that a lot of that growth happened just through friendship and conversations like this. I think you're absolutely right that social media do not perform the same function in our lives. It's kind of a hit and run thing. If I see my friends have a new grandchild, I go and I comment, yay, that kind of thing. And it's hit and run, and they give me a thumbs up because they like that I acknowledge their new grandchild. But it's not conversation. We're not talking about the difference that having a grandchild has made in their lives, which has its ups and has its downs and all of that stuff. We're not really having that encounter that's necessary in order to make a friendship. The early Christians were willing to do that, and it was a rare thing in the ancient world to have someone like that in your life, to have a friend in your life, a true friend. It's always been a difficult thing, and it's always been a thing that requires attention and some degree of work. Friendship, but it became the means of salvation in the gospel. How did Jesus save people? He saved them by befriending them. There's this phrase, you can search it in the New Testament, draw near. Draw near. See how often it comes up. And it's all about drawing near to the Lord. And the way you do that is by drawing near to other people and drawing them nearer to the Lord too. So salvation comes by way of friendship. Jesus said that astonishing thing, I call you friends. I call you friends, which would have been scandalous at the time, because Cicero had this idea, and Aristotle had before him, that in order to have a friendship, you had to be equals, social equals, economic equals. You had to have the same amount of money. You had to agree about everything, and then you can have a friendship. Well, there can be no equality with Jesus. He's God. He's the eternal Son of God. He's all good, and I'm not. And yet he's befriended me. He said, I call you friends. So we learn from Jesus, and we go out and befriend the world, and the early Christians show us how that was done. And cities were converted by this means.
I don't think I've given a lot of thought to that idea of the ancient idea of friendship as it relates to Jesus. That's thank you for sharing that. It's very, very interesting, because no, we can't ever be on the same level as Jesus. He is God. And I think our modern notion of friend is wholly inadequate, but I hadn't thought about that particular sort of angle. It really is remarkable that Jesus, I mean, every time I think about the incarnation, I get blown away again. And I think we all should, right? Like, God himself became man so that we could become like God. That's something else. I mean, you could ponder that for the rest of your life and never run out of things to ponder about it.
I think you're right, and you think about so many of the moving scenes in the gospel. They're scenes of friendship. These are the things we do with our friends. We have dinner with them. We have we have a fish fry by the lake shore. That kind of thing. We go out in a boat with them. We do all kinds of things together, and I think the Gospels are intended to help to make us feel that way. That Christ is befriending us, that we're in the boat. That we're at that fish fry by the lake shore. That all of these things are events in a friendship, and we're part of that friendship.
Even after the resurrection, the fish fry on the beach, right? So
yeah, that's the one I was thinking about.
It didn't end with the resurrection, so
right.
This continues, and now our Lord comes to us in the Eucharist in such a beautiful way, and through the sacramentality of the Church. It is very, very remarkable. I paused. I don't have another question because I'm still thinking about how cool that is that Jesus is our friend.
I love it too. I love it too.
So in the book, obviously, there's a lot of research that went into this. I mean, you're quoting from various primary and secondary sources. What for someone who wants to learn more about this world, so to speak? Obviously, these cities are all very different, but let's say the early church, like pre-Nicene, ante-Nicene church. What's a good entry point to learn more about the fathers?
Oh boy, I'd say my book, The Fathers of the Church, would be a good entry point for people. I'm a big fan of the works of Robert Louis Wilken,
Me
and I
too.
love
Yeah.
his works, especially his book, "The Christians as the Romans Saw Them," because that book helped me to understand and even attain a certain degree of sympathy with the pagan
Mm.
persecutors. You get it. Wilkin helps you to understand why they saw Christianity as a threat that needed to be eradicated. So Wilkin's a great historian for that reason. He's written a history of this period called the First Thousand Years, and
Yeah, I was
that's a
gonna
wonderful.
recommend that. That's one of my favorite books.
And then another book called The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, which I highly recommend. So get your hands on those and you'll be happy. If you want to understand the role of cities, the great book, in my opinion, is Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity. And
Mm.
in that book, he's building on the work of Wayne Meeks and others. But that book is just wonderful. And I want to emphasize that this kind of activity wasn't going on only in cities. There's a book that recently uh, came out from Oxford University Press by Thomas A. Robinson, and it's called "Who Were the First Christians?" Right, and uh, and Robinson makes the case that evangelization took place at the same rate in the rural areas, that it was happening at the same rate. The difference is that we don't have as much of a record for it. He finds the evidence and he kind of puts it out there, but even most of the evidence we have of evangelization in the rural areas, well, that evidence came from the cities,
Yeah.
because it's in the cities where we preserve writings, right? And that's where
Right.
people go to congregate and make culture and that sort of thing. So we have more ruins to speak of and more ruins
Mm.
to examine and artworks and that kind of thing where the cities were. So I didn't want to say that nothing was happening in the rural regions, um, but yeah, you see
It's
what I mean.
it's tremendously difficult to do historical research in these periods because there's not a lot of information um, as compared with recent history where
Oh
we
yeah,
write everything down, right? So
right.
um, it is it is a very, call it a niche subject, right? Like you gotta be really into a specific time period and get deep in the weeds and hopefully have some skill with languages as well.
I found that's a pretty big niche. Well, well, here's my story, right? About well, almost 30 years ago, our Sunday visitor approached me and asked me to write an introduction to the Fathers of the Church. They really didn't think there was any market for such a book, right? But they saw that there needed to be such a book, and they figured, well, we'll subsidize that and we'll put such a book out there. It's just a layperson's introduction to the fathers, and so I wrote that book. And it's almost 30 years ago now. I've written more than 70 books in that time. It remains my best-selling book of all that time. And most of the other books that I've written are just kind of riding the coattails of that first book that I wrote, and they're all books about the early church. So I think there is a certain hunger. If the
Oh,
book doesn't
absolutely.
sell, then you don't get a second chance. There is no second book, there's no third book, and I've written 70. I think that I've demonstrated there's something of an interest there, and I think it's part of the same interest that there's been for the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. People want to understand where they came from, not only genealogically, but spiritually. There's a great interest in roots.
Right.
Why do I hold these ideas? Where did these ideas originate? And the early Christians, show us where our ideas originate. I read Saint Ignatius of Antioch. He was writing in 107 AD. I read his words and I recognize my parish in his letters. It's that vivid and the connection is that strong. So I think that gives us a sense, wow, I'm part of something big, and I'm so part of something that's lasted a long time, and I'm part of this thing that originated with Jesus Christ. And when you read the history and you see what the church has survived, not only from persecution outside, but also from scoundrels inside, you marvel at it and you say, this could not have lasted 2,000 years without divine guidance, without divine protection, because no other institution remains from the time of the Roman Empire. None.
It's an important thing that you bring up. I have seen the hunger, but philosophically speaking, I think that a lot of people in our modern world are convinced that progress and modernity means to jettison the old. That there's nothing we can learn from the ancients, and we've finally got it right now. And it's laughable because it's completely wrong-headed, and there's it couldn't be further from the truth. And so when I brought up it's a small niche, I don't think that the readers are small. I think people have a hunger for it, but the people who are doing this work in research, I think, is a fairly small number.
That's true.
Which is unfortunate. I wish it would be far, far more, because we have so much to learn from the ancients. We our culture has largely jettisoned the Via Antiqua, like almost entirely, in favor of modernity, and to our detriment.
Yeah.
So it's something that absolutely needs to be reclaimed. And I see books like yours doing that work, at least on the popular level, of getting into people's hearts and minds that, no, there's something good here.
Yeah. And I hope to get people to read beyond my books too. That's one of the things I like to do, is to get in and introduce them to some of the ideas that are floating around right now among people who study the period. I often say that I write the books that I need to read, but nobody else is writing them. Right?
Right.
There's all this great academic work going on, but very few people are writing the books that are intended to reach a popular market, ordinary people with ordinary education like me. So that's what I'm trying to do, and those are the people I'm trying to reach.
Well, and thank you for doing it. It's such an important work.
No.
Where can people find more resources?
Where can they find more resources? Well, they're in all kinds of places. I check the footnotes, okay? When you read my books, look at the footnotes.
I guess I'll be a little bit more direct. Would you like to plug anything with the St. Paul Center?
Oh yeah. Well, go to the St. Paul Center. You'll find a bunch of my books there, and you'll also find a bunch of great resources. My own website is fathersofthechurch.com. You'll usually find my books at the best prices at catholicbooksdirect.com. catholicbooksdirect.com. It's a family-owned business, and you can feel good about shopping there.
Fantastic. Well, Mike, thank you for this conversation and your time. Any final words for our listeners?
Boy, I don't know. Just get to know the church fathers. You won't regret it. They're larger than life characters, but they too are open to the friendship with us, and they become friends once you read them. I mentioned Ignatius of Antioch. Go to him first. Read his 7 letters. You'll become addicted to reading in antiquity.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And for those listening, please check out all of Mike Aquilina's books. Go to the St. Paul Center. I'll put I'll put what you mentioned in the show notes for Catholic Books Direct. And for those who are listening, please go to gooddistinctions.com to subscribe for free and follow everything that I'm putting out here as well. Mike, thanks so much.
Hey, thanks again for inviting me.